This is not a story that the mainstream media seems interested in talking about, yet they constantly decry violence that they say is prompted by rhetoric coming from the right. It seems that that's a logical contradiction.
There's at least two different double standards going on here, Liz, which is the first of which you just pointed out, right? There's the media demand that every Republican condemn, for example, the violence in El Paso, which every Republican did, up to and including the president, easily and promptly. But there is that demand from the media that mainstream folks on the right condemn any violence that appears to have arisen from the fringes of the right. There's no corresponding demand on mainstream Democrats, like Mayor Ted Wheeler, to condemn violence and extreme leftism, which brings me to the second part, or the second double standard here. And that's the double standard between the way that we treat the far right and the far left. Okay, Antifa explicitly takes its name from the communists who were brawling with the fascists in the 1920s and 30s. That is their inspiration. Both of those factions were incredibly violent and ultimately overwhelmed the Weimar Republic, and the fascists won, and we all know that story. But we do not treat the far left and communism, and even violent communism, the same way that we treat the far right. And we should be treating them both as terrible, extreme, violent ideologies. But we don't treat them the same. So, for example, if a Republican presidential candidate and senator like Bernie Sanders praised, as we know, the USSR, the Soviet Union. There's no comparison, there's no way that a Republican presidential candidate would ever praise a fascist regime from the past, a murderous fascist regime, and get away with it. It would be incredibly, it would be covered wall to wall, all the news outlets would cover it, and Republicans themselves would not stand for that. And yet there's this incredible double standard between far-left violent communism and far-left violent fascism in the way that it's treated in our discourse. So there's at least two double standards going on here, neither of which I think is healthy for the country.
No, it's certainly not healthy for the country. I mean, literally, it's physically damaging for the people who are the target of these attacks. It's similar to what I've said about racism. It seems to me that rhetorically the left condemns racism. They claim to be fighting against racism, yet when any racism or bigotry comes from members of their own party, the Democrats are fine with it. We saw that with how they handle Al Franken, Louis Farrakhan, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. If the racism or the bigotry comes from their own party, they're fine with it. That seems to be the same standard that they apply to violence. If there's even the whisper of agitation or violence that comes from anybody on the right, the left makes haste to blame every Republican, every voter of President Trump for that. But when the political violence comes from members of their own party, they seem to be okay with it as long as the people are members of their own party. That is not an environment in our nation that we can tolerate. We must actually come together, left and right, and say violence is not part of our political dialogue, and we all collectively reject it. This mayor cannot seem to do that.